Welcome to this lesson for Higher Biology, which today is looking at Key Area 3 of Unit 3, and we're focusing on crop protection. So previous to now, we've just looked at what weeds, pests and disease may do to crops, and we're going to move on to how we can potentially protect crops using a range of different methods. After this, we'll move on to look at potential alternatives to using the methods described in this lesson. So, we would expect you to understand the measures put in place to protect crop plants. You will need to be able to describe the difference between cultural and chemical methods of protection, describe how systemic and selective herbicides work, and give an example of protecting crops prior to a disease outbreak. So to begin with, we're going to consider what we would refer to as cultural methods. So these methods are essentially ones which have been used fairly historically. They're ones that were developed over hundreds of years since the agricultural revolution, and really are the ones that we've used when we didn't have chemical alternatives. So to begin with, on the top left there, you'll see a tractor with a plough. So ploughing is a method used frequently to try and get rid of weeds in particular. So what they'll do is they'll turn over the top 20 centimetres or so of soil every time, and that will cause weeds to be dug up and buried, and they're usually buried deep enough that they will then just die off and decompose. They're not likely to come back again. On the bottom left there, we've got some weeding going on. So this is an organic farm, and we've got individuals hand weeding the area where the crops are going to be placed. And then on the right hand side, we've got a diagram of what's referred to as crop rotation. So essentially in crop rotation, we're looking at a series of different crops being grown one after the other on the same piece of ground over 4 different growing seasons. So as you can see, the top left, field 1, we start with potatoes, and what would then happen is it would be rotated into field 2 for the next season. And the cabbage would move down, the peas would move left, the onions would move up, and so on. So they would rotate around over 4 different seasons, so that each different crop type has been planted in each different field in each different season. And the reason for that is that any pathogens in the soil from the first crop are then not going to be able to grow on the second crop. So if we've developed some potato nematode worm, for example, in field 1, the potatoes have been moved on. They are now in field 2, so the new crop of potatoes are going to be unaffected by that. And then the onions, which have been moved into field 1, are going to be unaffected by it because it can only affect the potato crop. And so consequently, that's one of the ways we can avoid sort of transferring disease from crop to crop over time. We can also potentially, as you'll notice there, we've got peas are nitrogen fixing, so they have rhizomes on their roots and are able to fix nitrogen into the soil. So when you grow those in any field, you're able to add some nitrogen back into the soil, which could be potentially useful for the next crop coming along. So those are what we refer to as cultural methods. You have your ploughing, weeding and crop rotation are all methods that we've used over time, and these could be used in conjunction with chemicals in order to minimise the impact of weeds, pests or disease on your crops. Now, when it comes to chemical methods, that's going to depend very much on the type of the threat to the crop. Generally speaking, we are using the term pesticides to cover any of these types of chemical methods. When we get a bit more specific, we're really talking about herbicides, are the ones which kill weeds, insecticides will kill insects, and fungicides are going to be used to remove most diseases. And most of these will come in the form of selective or systemic, and they may be contact or systemic as well. And we're going to discuss what's meant by each of those. So when it comes to a selective herbicide, these really are going to mimic the action of a plant growth hormone. So it speeds up the metabolism of the plant to the extent that they use up their food reserves and they die. Now, what makes them selective is the fact that they affect broad-leaved plants more than they affect narrow-leaved plants. Now, the majority of wheat crops and other grass crops are very, very narrow-leaved, so they're unaffected. So as the spray hits all of these plants, it's actually only going to affect the broadleaf weed, and that's what makes it selective. It's just going to pick out on those, on the action of the weeds themselves. We also have what we refer to as contact or systemic herbicides. So we have contact essentially is when the herbicide is just going to affect the sort of top layer, the visual part of the plant that you can see above the ground. So the herbicide is applied, and what happens is the foliage that's above the ground is going to die off quite quickly. However, this taproot down here is unaffected, and consequently a few weeks later our weed plant re-emerges. On the other hand, a systemic herbicide is going to affect the internal systems of the plant. So when it's sprayed, the selective herbicide itself is actually absorbed into the plant and transported around all of the plant parts, and a few weeks later the weed is still has still died off. It will not be able to return. So that's got a more lethal effect on the leaves and the roots of the plant. When it comes to insecticides, it's a very similar story. So contact pesticides are going to kill the pest when it comes into contact with it, and that may also remain as a protective layer of a sort of poisonous residue on the plant, and it will take effect when the pest comes in contact with it. So you can see we've got direct contact here where the pest has been sprayed with it. If the pest return comes to the plant after the spraying has taken place, that would be secondary contact, so it's going to be affected as it comes on to the leaves of the plant. And our ingested or systemic insecticide is one that will be absorbed by the plant, transported to all its parts, and then when the insect comes along and eats the plant, it's going to ingest the poison and die. And that again can be more effective depending on the type of pest. You're going to need some insects, for example, will suck out the sap of different plants. So if our systemic insecticide has been passed on to all of the different parts, it's more likely to be affected that way. And lastly, our contact versus systemic fungicides essentially work in a very, very similar way. So our contact ones are the ones which are just going to affect the visible part of our plant. And we might have an issue there where that's going to happen prior to a fungal attack. When the fungal spores land and begin to germinate, they're going to absorb that poison and they're going to die. However, it could potentially be washed away by rain. And any newly emerging leaves are also going to be unprotected. A systemic fungicide, on the other hand, is again absorbed by the crop plant and is transported throughout the whole plant, and that gives generally a better protection against a fungal attack than contact fungicides. And to look at an example of fungal diseases particularly, we have potato blight, which is caused by a fungus with airborne spores. Now, it actually needs very specific temperatures and humidity, and those conditions need to last for several days. Now, that information is actually monitored in terms of the weather and the weather forecasts, and there is a blight watch service run by something called the Potato Council, where they are watching for those specific conditions. So they're watching for those specific temperatures and humidity that mean it's likely that those spores may be released by the fungus and may be able to survive and be transported through the air. Now, when that happens, or when they see these conditions are coming, it's possible then for farmers to go around and they will apply the fungicide prior to the disease outbreak, and that's generally considered to be more effective than treating the diseased crop. So if you're able to sort of predict where the disease may appear, then it's going to be more effective to quickly treat your crops with the fungicide beforehand, and that generally speaking has a better result. So quick overview of how we can control our pests then. So we've got cultural methods such as ploughing, weeding and crop rotation. We've got chemical methods, herbicides, pesticides and fungicides. Herbicides might be selective, systemic or contact. Pesticides might be contact or systemic, and fungicides might be contact or systemic. So from that, you should be able to describe what we mean by cultural or chemical methods of protection. You should be able to describe what we mean by systemic and selective herbicides and how they're going to work, and be able to give an example of protecting crops prior to the outbreak of a particular disease. As ever, if you have any questions, please do get in touch either by leaving a comment below, visiting the website, or sending me an email at the address to follow.